It always seems to be sunny when I come here. I think this must be about the fifth occasion. The sun always seems to shine in West London. It's great to be back. I'm going to talk a little bit differently this time. Some of the stuff that I talked about last time I will cover again, update you with. But I thought I'd take a slightly different slant on things, as you'll find out in a second. So, but first of all, just the backgrounder. What is motor neuron disease? Well, we all know what it is, we wouldn't be here otherwise. But I'm coming at it from the scientist's perspective. You know, motor neuron disease is a disease of the motor nerves, these long, thin wires that effectively connect the old grey matter up here to the muscles in the various parts of our body. They help us to convert thought into action. And they are incredible cells, these motor neurons. They're too small to be seen by the human eye, but they can stretch to over 1 meter in length. So if the main part of the motor neuron is found at the bottom of the spinal cord, it can go all the way down to make you wiggle your big toe. And yet these things are a few millionths of a meter in diameter. So they're incredibly long, incredibly thin, and incredibly physically fragile. And it's amazing they ever work at all, never mind in most cases function quite happily throughout our lives. We have quite a few of them, and they're all bundled together in what we call nerve tracts. And this is a human spinal cord. It's quite an impressive piece of dissection, actually. It was done about, I think, about 30 years ago. And they've separated out the nerve tracts of what we call the sensory and the autonomic nerves. So the sensory nerves, as the name suggests, carrying information from the outside world, pain, temperature, touch, pressure, back up to the brain. And the autonomic nerves, sometimes called them the housekeeping nerves, they're the ones that make you sweat when your body's overheating to try and cool you down, give you goose pimples, make your hair stand on end when you're cold. The ones that have been arranged coming off of this side are the motor nerve tracts. So these contain these very, very fine motor neuron fibers that are heading out to connect up with the muscles. Now, normally these guys would be the same thickness. It's pretty apparent, isn't it? You know, it looks like these have just frayed away. And that's because this person had motor neuron disease and has lost a large number of the motor neurons. Now, a person with MND, of course, can think about making that movement, but the problem is the lines are down. The signals can't get down to the muscles. MND itself is a bit of an umbrella term. It was actually coined by a neurologist, a rather appropriately named British neurologist called Lord Brain. And he said, well, there's several types. We think they're interconnected, but they are quite distinct. And they can be divided up in a variety of ways, but the way he cut the cake was based on what type of motor neurons are affected, because there's two basic types of motor neuron. We call them upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. And upper motor neurons, their main part of the cell is found right up at the top here of the brain, and they send their long thin wires down into the spinal cord. And it's there that they connect up with the lower motor neurons, which then send their wires out to connect up with the muscles. So the upper motor neurons are completely encased within the central nervous system, and the lower motor neurons are the ones that leave the central nervous system to connect up with the muscles. So if I want to make a movement, if I want to point my finger, move my hand, my brain has to get those commands down to the muscles. So it does it by sending these little electrical impulses down the upper motor neurons. They don't hang around, they go down about 100 miles an hour. The signal's transferred to the lower motor neurons. She goes shooting down my arm, tells the muscles to move, and the muscles contract. Now in reality, it's a lot more complex than that. I used to take 6 hours teaching medical students at Oxford how the brain tells the body to move. And you look like an intelligent bunch. You got the 2-minute version. So going back to the types of motor neuron disease, there are forms of motor neuron disease that specifically affect the upper motor neurons only. And the most common of these is something called primary lateral sclerosis. And when I say common, it maybe accounts for 1%, 2% of all newly diagnosed cases every year, so it's pretty rare. There's a condition that seems to specifically affect the lower motor neurons, called progressive muscular atrophy, but by far the most common form of the disease, more than 90% of cases, affects both the upper and the lower, and it's a real tongue twister, but one I'm sure you've come across, called amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS for short. And depending on whether these guys are degenerating faster than these ones or vice versa, can actually produce quite an array of symptoms, and it's one of the reasons that the disease takes so long to diagnose. So as Kapish mentioned, our portfolio has grown quite a lot over the 20 years that I've been with the Mnd Association. When I started, we were funding 3 projects and spending about £100,000. So we've now grown it a bit to 16 million and funding 90 projects, most of which is spent in the UK and Ireland. We do include Ireland. We don't have a border with Ireland as far as we're concerned. That won't be the only time I refer to Brexit, I'm sure, in this talk, as you'll find out. But we also fund in other parts of the world as well, because I'm a great believer that we should be funding the best research and the most relevant research, and it doesn't matter whether it's in London, UK, or London, Canada, if it's going to give us the answers we're looking for. But we do have a couple of criteria. The first is that the work in a lab abroad has to be unique in concept or design. In other words, no one in the UK is already doing that sort of work. And the second criterion is that they have to have a collaboration with a UK research group. And the idea is that new knowledge and new skills are actually imported in to help strengthen the UK research base. So what I was going to focus on today was the fact that £16 million sounds like a lot, but in the grand scheme of medical research, it's a drop in the ocean. So how can we get as many bangs for our buck as possible? And one of the ways is by trying to partner with other organisations, try and influence other organisations to invest in Mnd research. I'm Scottish, I like to see somebody else pay for it rather than me. And at the moment most of our projects actually will involve some aspect of funding from other sources, but at the moment about a quarter of the portfolio involves what I would call partnership funding. We have gone into this in the knowledge that there's money coming into Mnd research from another source as well. It's not just about the funding of the research, these are some of the current and recent partners. It's all about the supporting infrastructure, things like DNA banks, clinical research networks, but also we work with other organisations on how we communicate all the new research activity that's coming out to specialist audiences, as well, of course, as to public and people affected by motor neuron disease. I love this picture. I took this at the International Symposium, and that is Professor Amr Al-Chalabi from King's College London, and that's his last slide, and he's just showing all the funding agencies that have funded his work. So I'm going to give you some examples of our partnerships and also some of the projects, the research projects that we're funding. So the first one, which I have covered in previous talks, but is one that will be going for a few years, is something called Project Mind, trying to help understand what's causing MND. I'll talk about our partnerships with the National Institute for Health Research, so that's the research arm of the NHS. Here we go, a bit controversial maybe, the work that we do with the European Commission. And finally, the Medical Research Council, which is the main government funding agency for research into science and medicine, or at least medical science. So starting off with the first one, Project Mind. So it's all about trying to understand what causes this disease. If there was a single cause of MND, we'd have found it a long, long time ago. Clearly, it's much more complicated than that. It's what we call a multifactorial disease. And we believe it's a combination of genetic predisposition, along with environmental factors, against a background of an aging body that's less able to cope with things that are going wrong. You know how when you buy a new car and it comes with a 3-year, 30,000-mile warranty and you think, oh, isn't that brilliant? And then nothing goes wrong with the car. It's only when it hits 70,000, 80,000 miles that the bits start, as I'm beginning to find out, start falling off. And, you know, this is one of the challenges. MND, like Alzheimer's disease, like Parkinson's disease, is a disease that's linked to aging and the body less able to cope with whatever's starting to damage it. So, you know, because there isn't a single cause of the disease, the factors are like grains of sand on a set of balancing scales. And no one grain of sand is enough on its own to tilt the scales and cause the disease. So yes, you may be born with a genetic predisposition that you inherited from your father or your mother. It's sitting there on the scales don't move. Maybe you were particularly unlucky and you've inherited a genetic grain of sand from your father and one from your mother, scales still don't move. So you then have to go looking into the environment. Now I'm kind of pulling out these out of the air, but research has been done in each of these areas. You know, these events could happen before you're even born. Let's say when your mother was 6 months pregnant with you, she caught a cold, could be a grain of sand in the scales. You were dropped on your head as a baby, could be another grain of sand in the scales. You lived in the countryside when you were a kid and Farmer Giles was chucking his DDT over the crops every summer, another grain of sand in the scales. You were very sporty and athletic at school, played a lot of rugby, did a lot of cross-country running, another grain of sand. You went off to university, did the complete opposite. You smoked like a chimney, you drank like a fish, didn't get out of bed till 12 o'clock. You know, it could be another grain of sand in the scales. Maybe that was just me, I don't know. But it's the combination of these, you know, apparently innocuous and unrelated events that finally, after decades, can tilt the scales and cause the disease to manifest. Now, I've put up a picture of Stephen Hawking, who was, of course, our patron for many years, because he once asked me the question, well, why have I lived for so long with the disease? And I sat down with him and I went, imagine a set of balancing scales. All the time I was thinking, I'm talking Stephen Hawking, I'm talking Stephen Hawking. But, you know, as I said to him, well, maybe there's a good side to the scales as well. And maybe there was something in his genetic makeup that hadn't stopped the disease from happening, but was just pushing back the other way, which meant it wasn't progressing so quickly. So there's an increasing amount of interest, scientific interest, on this side of the scales as well. Why do some people live for 10, 20, 30, 50 years with this disease? Because if we can identify some of these factors, maybe we can develop drugs that act as a bigger weight in the scales and could be effective for everybody and not just these individuals. Of course, sometimes in 5 to 10% of cases, the disease does run in families. So there's a strong family history, and that indicates that there's a strong genetic factor involved. So this time, instead of a grain of sand, it may be a slightly larger weight, which increases the chances. It doesn't always mean that the disease will manifest, but it certainly increases the chances that the disease will occur. And that's one of the reasons that there's been so much interest in the genetic side of motor neuron disease. We've done lots of research in the past into the environmental factors, hasn't really got us very far. The genetic side is giving us an inroad, and that's because we actually have sequenced the human genome, what we call the Book of Life, all the genetic code that's hidden in this DNA that's present in every cell in our body. It is called the Book of Life sometime. If you go to the Wellcome collection, the Wellcome Trust building in Euston Road, you can actually see the first human genome that was ever sequenced. It was completed in 2000, and they've actually printed it out. And you can see it's not just one book, it's many, many volumes. It's enough to fill a bookshelf. So it's a very long read. It's not a particularly interesting read either, unless you're a geneticist, because it's basically just made up of 4 letters, A, G, C, and T. And all that means, this is the actual code bit, but they just stand for 4 different chemicals, different molecules that all link together and they all form the DNA. So just lots of A's, G's, C's and T's in there. And what we're looking for, effectively, is a single spelling mistake within these 24 volumes. These 3 billion letters of genetic code. And it's even more complex than that, because we've all got lots of different spelling mistakes for hair colour, for eye colour, for height, for weight, that sort of thing. You know, Ian, you have 100,000 differences in your genetic code to me, and Ross, I'll have 100,000 different from you, and you'll have 100,000 different from Ian. So how do you work out what spelling mistake are actually relevant to motor neuron disease? So it is a little bit like looking for a needle in a haystack. But we at least know the size of the haystack. It's 3 billion letters of genetic code. So, you know, maybe we can be a little bit smart. Maybe we could develop some technology that helped us work out where in the haystack these needles are likely to be. And maybe we could find a way of pulling the needle and maybe a whole load of other stuff out of the haystack and then just sift through that instead. And that's effectively, that's the basis of genetic research. And you go into a gene hunting lab. This is the Wellcome Sanger Centre just south of Cambridge, and you won't find any test tubes or Bunsen burners. You'll just find row after row of these gene sequencing, automated gene sequencing machines, where you put the sample in one end and you get a whole row of letters, 3 billion of them coming out the other. And then you need to do some serious number crunching, because a single human genome would basically cause my laptop here to grind to a halt. And yet, what researchers are doing now is analysing tens of thousands of these. So you need some pretty big toys, and this is the Surfsera supercomputer in Holland, which is used for a lot of the research that we're involved in. It's also used by the European Space Agency to map galaxies, which seems to involve a lot of computing power as well. So Project Mine is the big initiative that we're involved in, and it really started with these two gentlemen, Bernard Muller on the right and Robert Dan Stewart on the left, both very entrepreneurial businessmen in Holland, both diagnosed with MND at about the same time. And as Bernard tells the story, it kind of started with a freezer, because they went to visit their local care and research centre, which was at the University of Utrecht, and they're being shown around the labs, and they were shown this freezer that was full of DNA samples. And Bernard said, so what's this for then? Well, it's not really for anything at the moment, it's for later, because we can't afford to do the research, it's all very expensive, it's all very complicated. So are some of the answers to our disease sitting in this freezer then? Yeah, this freezer and a number of other freezers around the world. Well, shouldn't we be doing something about it? And out of that, Project Mine was born. Initially quite small, we were the third country to come in, but it's now a worldwide initiative. There are 20 countries around the world involved in this. And the plan is to sequence the genetic code of 22,500 people. That's 15,000 people with MND and 7,500 who don't have MND, because you've got to compare the genetic makeup of somebody with the disease to somebody who doesn't have the disease. It's still quite expensive. Each sample costs over $1,800 to sequence. It's all done by a company called Illumina, who are based in San Diego. They're kind of the Microsoft of gene sequencing. However, 15 years ago, it would have cost about $30 million to sequence a single sample, which gives you an idea. You think laptop computers and plasma TVs are coming down in price. That's nothing compared to this equipment, believe me. So we set a target of sequencing almost 10% of the worldwide total, because we had a DNA bank, and thanks to the Ice Bucket Challenge, we had the money suddenly to do this, and we're very close to completing it. We're just getting the sample data back from San Diego, and I think that will take us to about 98% of our target, something like that. And worldwide, they've got to about almost 50% of this target. And they've identified 7 or 8 new MND genes. And that's just so far. There's a lot more coming down the pipeline. So it's a very exciting initiative. It's a great example of kind of crowdfunding, where the scientists around the world have got together, they're sharing their samples, they're sharing their data, and the patient associations and charities in each country are helping to raise the money to pay for the gene sequencing. So, what does it all mean? You know, is this just an academic exercise? It allows scientists to publish research papers. I'd like to think there's a little bit of a rationale behind doing all of this. The first thing is that although it's not as simple as you find the cause, you find the cure, it is such a springboard to all the additional research that happens downstream. This is a graph of the number of scientific and medical research papers, because that's how the research community promotes their discoveries through the medical research literature. And this is since just after the war, and the red line is MND, and you can see that for many years, for decades, it kind of bumps along the bottom. I'd like to think the founding of the Mnd Association in 1979 was the catalyst for this activity. I don't think we can claim all the credit for worldwide activity, but we can claim some of it. But the main driver behind this exponential rise and the amount of knowledge that's coming out about MND is the discovery of genes linked to the disease, which first started in the early to mid 1990s, and as you can see is rising exponentially as well. Just for comparison, I've put in a couple of other rare progressive neurodegenerative diseases: Huntington's disease in purple, which you'll have heard of, progressive supranuclear palsy, which you may not have, but you will have heard of Dudley Moore, the actor and comedian. He died of PSP. And you can see that, you know, the good news is everything is rising. There's more work being done, more discoveries being made than ever before. But there's something about MND that's really grabbed the attention of the international research community. And that can only be a good thing. More people around the world doing more work on this disease. And as I said, it's been driven by these gene discoveries. The other thing is that if you have these genetic factors, particularly the ones that are in the familial forms of the disease, so these are, you know, pretty large weights on the scale, you can take that knowledge into the lab and you can start to try and work out, well, how does this cause kill motor neurons? And the analogy I often use is it's like tributaries of a river. You know, a river has many, many different sources usually, and form tributaries that come together that lead to this final common pathway that leads out to the sea. So MND, we know, familial MND has many, many different genetic causes. And what we can do is try and work out how these causes all come together. And indeed, just last week, the latest new genetic cause was discovered through the Project Mine initiative, and it was led by one of the research teams we fund at the University of Sheffield. Now, we don't know precisely where this joins the river yet, but it's a completely new cellular pathway that had never been considered to be relevant to MND before, so it's going to add considerable value. And the other key thing is that if we can identify, you know, if we want to stop this disease, if we want to dam this river, the best place to do it is at the point where all the tributaries converge, because that way, if we're stopping things or slowing things down, it will have an impact on all forms of the disease, no matter what the original cause. So, you know, for example, we'd want to do it down here, just downstream of where all the factors come together. And a paper by another of our research groups, just a few months back, actually found a new cellular change within motor neurons, secondary motor neurons in ALS, that seems to occur in every single case of MND that's been studied so far. And within about 3 days of that paper being published on the internet, the leading drug company in this area of research from the United States was on the phone to this researcher saying, okay, tell us a little bit more about this, because we're really interested. And now he's working with that company to try and see if they can develop a treatment that they can bring through to the clinic. The other thing is that if you're a family member where there's a family history of the disease, and you know, I know one example in East Anglia where 6 out of 7 brothers and sisters in adulthood developed MND. That's clearly one extreme end of the spectrum. But if there's a strong family history of 2, 3, maybe more family members over 2, 3 generations developing the disease, younger family members are now saying, well, can I have a genetic test to see whether I carry this disease? And in particular, people who are thinking of having a family themselves. So now, because we've identified a lot of these genes, they can apply to the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority to undergo a process called Pre-Implantation Genetic Determination, or PGD. And basically, it's in vitro fertilization, test tube baby stuff. It's been around for a long, long time, but there's no fertility problems here. We're not doing this to treat a problem with infertility. We're doing this to try and ensure that a disease-causing gene is not passed on to the next generation. So, sperm from the father meets egg from the mother in the laboratory, and the embryos are generated, and when they get to about the 16 or 32 ball of cells stage, one of the cells is just pinched off, doesn't do the embryo any harm, and they can genetically test that cell. And of course, if it carries the disease gene, you set that one aside. If it doesn't carry the disease gene, that gets implanted into the mother. And the first baby in the world, not just in the UK, for an MND family, I think has just had his 6th or 7th birthday. And it actually happened just down the road at King's College Hospital. And I've got this lovely quote from the mother. Our son was the first child in the UK conceived through PGD for motor neurone disease. It's just amazing to know that he's okay and he won't go through this terrible illness. So for that family, they know a disease that has blighted that family for generations will not be passed on to the next generation. Ironically, 2 weeks after the baby was born, his uncle died of MND. But, you know, I think the most recent thing, and this is just something that's come in the past couple of years, is, well, if you've got a bad genetic factor in these families that's pushing the scales down, what if you could switch it off? What if you could remove it? Would that help the scales to rebalance, or at least, you know, stop them tilting quite so aggressively? And that's a strategy that's being taken for the 2 most common forms of familial MND, SOD1 MND, which accounts for about 2–3% of all forms of MND, and C9orf72, which accounts for about 8% of cases. And the idea here is that rather than trying to target the river quite far downstream, you're actually just targeting individual tributaries and trying to dam off those ones. So they won't necessarily work for the other forms, but they may work for these specific types. And it's a technology, I'm not going to go into it in any detail, but it's very exciting stuff called antisense technology. It's actually been used successfully to treat a childhood type of motor neurone disease called spinal muscular atrophy, and they're now moving into clinical trials. There's an ongoing SOD1 trial in SOD1 patients, and there should be one in C9orf72 patients starting hopefully this summer. So the other area, other partnership I wanted to talk about was the work that we do with the Department of Health, and in particular the National Institute for Health Research. We support about 23 multidisciplinary MND clinics across England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and here they are. Don't know why Northern Ireland has been displaced to the northeast of England, but never mind. And, you know, they probably see 80% of people with MND will attend one of these care centres for some aspect of their multidisciplinary care. So that's a great tool for doing clinical and healthcare research as well. You know, relatively large numbers of people with this relatively rare disease coming through the doors of these hospitals. So back in 2006, we started talking with the Department of Health about establishing a clinical network called the Dementias and Neurodegenerative Diseases Research Network. So it was initially being developed to just cover Alzheimer's disease, but we managed to persuade the Department of Health that we should cover things like Parkinson's and MND as well. And when it was first launched, there were just under 600 people with MND that year participating in clinical research studies, and a small number of studies. You can see how it's grown considerably over the years, to the extent now that there are more people participating in MND clinical studies than have MND. Work that one out. I'll give you the answer. The reason is that you can participate in more than one study, of course. You could participate in a register, you could participate in a drug trial, you could participate in an MRI study, and also this includes people who don't have the disease, because you might be doing something where you need to actually have a control group as well. But even so, it's a huge number. That actually represents about 1 in 5 of all the people participating in a neurodegeneration clinical study within the NHS. So that includes Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease. Yet MND probably represents about 1 in 200 of the cases, and yet in terms of the research, it's 1 in 5 of the research that's going on. It's not just about facilitating that. We have to put our money where our mouth is, and of the almost 80 studies that have been funded since the network was first set up, Mnd Association funding has been very important to that. Those of you who are arithmetically minded will see that that comes to more than 100%, and that's because there's a lot of joint funding going on, a lot of partnership funding going on. Now I'm going to give you some examples of some of the work that we've been doing recently and is ongoing within the network. One of them you might have heard of, it's featured in Thumbprint a couple of times, which was the head-up collar. People with MND can have neck muscle weakness, and the collars that are around really aren't very good. You get these things which basically keep your neck warm and not a lot else. There's zero support. Or you've got these things that are developed for people who have been in car crashes, for example, and they have to be held really, really rigid. There wasn't anything kind of in between these two extremes that seemed to work. Just on the partnership theme, you can see the number of different funders that were involved in this study, and it was really a patient-led study. It came from a patient support group at the University of Sheffield who said, you know, there's a need here. So they got together with healthcare professionals and clinicians, with engineers, with fashion designers as well. It's the only time I've actually seen a funding application which actually had seamstress time put into it. And they developed a really innovative neck support, which actually can be, it's like ribs that can be velcroed on, so that if people have more neck weakness on one side than the other, then that can be addressed in a very, very bespoke fashion. And we helped with some of the initial testing of the current neck collars, checking where all the key pressure points were, and we also provided funding for the field testing of the prototype collars, which are now on the market and available through the NHS. One of the interesting ones, one of the areas I'm really interested in at the moment is nutritional support for people with MND. Normally, the amount of food we take in should be balanced by the amount of energy that we're expending through our kind of basal body metabolism. You know, it's like the car engine idling along, the car's at rest, and also, of course, the amount of physical activity we do, how fast we're driving the car. In the Western world, we have a slight problem because there's usually an imbalance. I have to say, not really within this room, but where, you know, the food intake probably exceeds both the physical activity and the basal metabolism. In MND, however, there's a lot of evidence that there's actually something else going on. That people with MND seem to exhibit a metabolic hyperactivity. In other words, the cells in their body are actually burning energy at a faster rate than the rest of the general population. And that might actually be linked, this is my little personal theory, that might be linked to more physical activity as well. You know how you hear about sportsmen seem to have a higher incidence of developing MND? Well, maybe if their cells are burning energy at a higher rate, if that's happening when you're a child, maybe you're drawn in to sports as an outlet for that, and you continue with that into adulthood, and as a result you see more people at a higher level of sporting achievement being diagnosed with MND. How are we doing with the EV there?
Can I ask a question about that? Because that's really, while they're fixing it. So, there are certain types of people who burn quicker than the rest of us, and they are known as sporty people. And that burning then becomes part of an illness. Is that right?
Potentially. I'd have to do a much longer talk to go into the detail of this, but you know, some people are born, shall we say, more physically fitter. You know, their genetic makeup is, you know, endows them with physical fitness. The downside of that, there's always a downside, is it might slightly increase the risk of something else. You know, that's effectively I'm trying to think of the Bruce Springsteen song, Born to Run.
Yeah.
And the danger is, perhaps, that it just, you know, there's just a slight counterbalance to having those advantages. And this maybe illustrates it. This is actually, it's a very messy graph. I'll try and take you through it. What it is looking at body mass index changes. And, you know, as we get older, look at the dashed lines here. Our BMI changes as we get older and we get a little bit heavier. For people with MND, this is the straight lines here, it kind of follows that, but then it suddenly seems to change. And this can happen several years before the disease actually appears. 5 years, 10 years before the disease appears. We certainly know that when a person is diagnosed with MND, that weight loss is a very important prognostic indicator. The faster you're losing weight after you've been diagnosed, the quicker the disease is likely to progress. So there's clearly something in here about metabolism, about diet, about exercise. And one of the ways we're trying to address that is through a NIHR-funded clinical trial, effectively, called HiCals, which is high calorie, high energy supplementation of people's diet, to see if we can actually try and bring this balance back on an even keel. And the Mnd Association, that's all funded by the Department of Health, but the Mnd Association has bolted on another specific study called post-gas, which is looking at people who have had a gastrostomy, the feeding tube, after they start to develop swallowing difficulties, because it appears that 50% of people, even after they've had the gastrostomy and should be receiving the nutrition, they still continue to lose weight. And we need to try and address that. And it's quite possible that if we can get this right, we can maybe alter the trajectory of the disease. The care centres are core to this, and one thing that's become clear over the years is that going to a care centre does actually not just improve a person's quality of life, it actually keeps them alive longer. This work was originally done in Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, where they have one multidisciplinary MND care centre in the whole country, in Dublin. And the rest of the country, they have general neurology clinics. And they showed through a register that if you attended the clinic at Beaumont Hospital, you lived 6 months longer than if you attended a general neurology clinic. Now that put a lot of Irish neurologists' noses out of joint, as you can well imagine. And it wasn't a criticism of their methods, it was just about the fact that timely, coordinated, multidisciplinary care can have an impact. And we've done the same sort of research at our centres. We've looked at survival before the care centre was established compared with after the care centre was established. And the blue line is before here, the red line is after. This is the Sheffield Care Centre, and any shift to the right is a good thing. And this is the King's Care Centre. It's not quite as pronounced, but the purple line is before and the green line is after. So just multidisciplinary care on its own, probably better and more timely intervention can have an impact. And we need to make sure that that extends beyond just the care centres, and it's one of the reasons that we've started to establish a national MND register. So the purpose of this, well, there's some even more basic questions than that. One of them is, well, how many people with MND are there in the country? Because the NHS doesn't know. And we know we're in touch with a large number of people and we can guesstimate, but we don't actually know. So the idea behind the register is we find out how many people have the disease, where they are as well, because that can improve care planning. We can then ensure that the multidisciplinary care is available according to patient need. But it's also got a research angle as well. And the first thing is we want to give people with MND more opportunity to participate in research from their own homes. So one of the projects that's going on at the moment is people are self-assessing themselves using the scale that neurologists usually use to assess disease progression. And we want to just check that a patient's own assessment is as accurate as the neurologist, because that would open up a whole load of research that could be done by patients themselves. And then finally, to build on this so that we can start to look perhaps at these environmental factors and the interplay with genetic factors, and not just on a national basis but on an international basis, because there are other registers in Italy, Holland, Ireland, Scotland, Australia, and we can bring all of this information together. Now, for many years I've got to say the register felt a little bit like that. It takes a lot of effort to put everything in place, particularly within a National Health Service which isn't really very connected, it's not very national. However, we're getting there. We've kind of established the register now, and we're probably covering about 60% of the country by geography, if not population, and I'm hoping that by the end of this year we'll be a lot closer to 100%. So the care centres, of course, are also very important if we're going to run clinical drug trials. And this is where I mentioned our third partner, the European Commission. Whichever way you voted, European Commission funding has been very important for rare diseases like MND, because it allows cross-border collaboration. You know, the nature of a lot of research funding is it's quite parochial. You know, we prefer to fund in the United Kingdom. The UK government prefers to fund in the United Kingdom. European funding says, no, no, you work with you, you work with you, you work with you, and here's the money. So it actually allows the best researchers to come together. And one of the really exciting areas is that it can lead to clinical drug trials that are actually run by the clinicians themselves, and you don't have to wait for a drug company to come along. And this is called drug repurposing or drug recycling. It's taking a drug that's already on the market for another disease that the science has developed, where we can say, well, actually, that drug might be useful in this disease as well. And the most famous repurposed drug in the world, probably, is one called Viagra. Some of you might have heard of. Viagra was initially being developed for ischemic heart disease, and it wasn't actually very good at doing its job, but the men who were participating in the trial kept reporting this side effect. And some smart person in Pfizer went, we could maybe use that for something else that men sometimes complain about as well. And it turned into a multi-billion-dollar product for the company. And indeed, closer to home, oops, hang on a minute, something's gone wrong, and I'm going to have to Closer to home, riluzole is actually a kind of repurposed drug because it was originally being developed for epilepsy, but it wasn't actually very good. And so the company went, well, we can't market this one, we'll stick it on the shelves. And then the science kind of caught up, and they realized, well, this pathway that we were trying to treat, this chemical change we were trying to treat in epilepsy, seems to be involved in MND as well. Well, we've got this drug, it's been tested in lots of humans already, let's just test it in a clinical trial for MND. So, you know, we've got a record of this, and the hope is that there are other things already out there that could be tested cheaply, quickly, and shave years and years of laboratory and preclinical research off of the drug development process. So we're involved in a couple of trials at the moment. One of them is called MyRECALS, which stands for Modifying Immune Response and Outcomes in ALS. If you're going to get European Commission funding, you've got to have a decent acronym. That's the starting point. So European Commission is putting €6 million into that. We're topping it up by another 600,000. And the Doddy Weir Foundation has recently come in with another 300,000. And another study which should hopefully be starting to recruit later this year is looking at a product called Tubtra. Sorry, I'll go back to this one first of all. This is testing a low dose of a drug called Interleukin 2, which is used to treat certain types of cancer. It's a really nasty drug, but the doses that are being used in MND are about 1% of the ones used in cancer. And at least so far in the preliminary studies, we haven't seen any of the side effects associated with the drug. This other one,